The Nintendo GameCube is my all-time favorite video game console by a pretty large margin. However though, if one thing sucks about it, it is that collecting for the system has gotten pretty outrageous in recent years. Thankfully enough, there are quite a few games that are just okay or mediocre for the system that don't go for too much money, but you can still have fun with, which is why today I present to you all good enough games for the Nintendo GameCube. First off, let's start with some first-party Nintendo games. I want to mention Wave Race Blue Storm. This was actually a launch game for the system, and a sequel to the Nintendo 64 game simply titled Wave Race. Wave Race on the N64 is easily one of the system's best games. It has great graphics for the time, an excellent soundtrack, and is just a lot of fun to play. Nintendo really nailed it here. It's such a good game, which is why I think Blue Storm is considered disappointing to a lot of people who were fans of the original. The graphics here aren't as impressive as the graphics were on the N64 original. The soundtrack is good, but not as good, and the controls aren't as good as the original. It leads to this game being disappointing, as I'm sure we all know a truly great game sequel is supposed to improve on the original, not make it worse. However, if you don't compare Blue Storm to the original and treat it as its own thing, you'll find what I did, and that's a fairly solid racing game for the system with a few flaws. The big issue with this game is that the controls are oddly slippery. Often feels like if you just slightly tilt the thumbstick one direction, your racer will go completely there. It makes turning a bit of a nightmare, which is kind of a huge problem as well. Racing tracks kind of need a lot of turning to make them interesting to play, but if you're willing to put up with this issue, the game is still quite a bit of fun. Racing jet skis is a fairly novel concept for a game in this day and age, and it's fun to experience that still. Overall, Wave Race Blue Storm is a good game that could have been great, but just barely misses the mark. Since I'm on the topic of extreme sports games, why don't I move on to the next game, Whirl Tour. Whirl Tour is pretty much a carbon copy of Tony Hawk Pro Skater. The game's trick system is basically ripped straight from Tony Hawk. It uses licensed music for the soundtrack, just like Tony Hawk, and you have to complete a set amount of objectives in every stage with a set time limit. That's also Whirl Tour's biggest problem. It's too similar to Tony Hawk, but feels off enough to where someone even vaguely familiar with Tony Hawk will notice that something isn't right here. The soundtrack is all licensed music, but it's nowhere near as iconic or memorable as any of the Tony Hawk games. The mission structure is the same, but the missions aren't as well thought out as a Tony Hawk game. They can be oddly vague on what you're supposed to do, or just really easy. Tony Hawk's balance is way better in that regard. Lastly, something about the trick system even feels off. I don't know how to explain it properly here, but I always get the feeling that when I bail, it's not my fault, but the game's fault for not registering where I was at while I was landing. It just doesn't have the polish or care put into it that the Tony Hawk franchise received at the time. It's not all bad though. Whirl Tour is still a fun game in its own right. It being on scooters is at least a good attempt to differentiate itself from Tony Hawk. I really want to point out how neat the skate parks are in this game. For instance, they're a bit more fantastical than Tony Hawk in this regard. I particularly want to point out the water park stage, which still to this day baffles me that a mainline Tony Hawk never made a stage like this. Yes, I know Tony Hawk 3 has the cruise ship, but that's just not the same, honestly speaking. Whirl Tour has a whole freaking water park, so it gets the point here. Whirl Tour is a decent enough Tony Hawk clone from the era, and if you're jonesing for more Tony Hawk because, well, those remakes of 3 and 4 got cancelled, I think this is a good game to pick up and give a whirl. Lego Bionicle is a game with a really undeserved negative reputation online in my opinion. I understand that if you're a huge Bionicle fan, why this game would disappoint you, as it does very little to expand the story or lore of Bionicle, but for the rest of us out there, this is a decent enough action platformer. One thing that I quite liked in this game was the stage variety. In each of the 6 stages you play as one of the Bionicles. I'm actually not sure what their names are I know very little to nothing about Bionicle, truthfully speaking. Anyways though, each stage has a gimmick that revolves around the chosen Bionicle for said stage. For instance, in the second level, it's a snow themed level, and you go down a mountain being chased by an avalanche. In another level, it's a beach themed level, so it has swimming segments. And I was actually pretty impressed with this stage in the game. Most games' swimming controls are just plain horrible, but this game handled them quite well, and dare I say, this was the best stage in the whole game in my opinion. This all sounds good, but it kind of leads into one of the game's biggest problems. It's just nothing really special. This feels like a by-the-numbers game that was made to basically just not upset any little kid who stumbled upon it. The difficulty is basically non-existent. I think I only died once or twice while playing it. It's also really short. It only took me about 2 hours to beat, and that was with me goofing around and trying to break the game. Lastly, the camera can just be awful at times. It's a bit hard to explain, but sometimes it just goes berserk for no reason and won't stop moving around. It can be super frustrating and maybe even disorienting to some people who have motion sickness. Despite all of this though, Bionicle is a solid enough 3D platformer and it's super cheap on eBay, so if you're looking for something to play through in an afternoon and have a good enough time with, this is a good game to pick up in my opinion. Space Raiders is kind of an odd game for me to mention here, as I don't really have a ton to say about it. It's a gritty reboot of Space Invaders of all series, where this time the invaders actually, well, invade Earth and humans have to fight and stop them. So you, as one of the 3 main characters, have to destroy all of them and fight the occasional boss or 2. This is just a really simple game at the end of the day and can be kind of boring because of it. Out of all the games today, this is the one that disappoints me the most, as all the tools are there. It looks fairly good, controls well, and sounds good. It's just missing something that really holds it back from being a great game. It's kind of unfortunate, really. One thing that is great is how cheesy all the dialogue and voice acting is. No, really, take a listen, you guys.
What happened here? Huh? Wake up!
Moving on to something a bit more interesting, I have Future Tactics: The Uprising. This is a weird kind of strategy action game, I suppose. Basically, you get to move your character a certain number of steps around and then attempt to shoot your opponent. If you've ever played Valkyria Chronicles on PlayStation 3 or 4, you'll know exactly what I mean with this description. This is a very unique take on this style of game, but the big problem with it is that, unfortunately enough, the story just isn't very interesting. It's weirdly enough very dull, and its attempts at humor just are painfully unfunny. However, the gameplay of this game is quite good. I personally am a big fan of the Valkyria Chronicles series, so getting to play something like this is really interesting, as this game feels like an early prototype to that game series. This is definitely one you should check out if you want to experience something completely unlike anything else in the GameCube's game library. So lastly, I want to talk about 007 Agent Under Fire. This is a first-person shooter using the 007 license, so naturally if it's not Nightfire or GoldenEye, it's never brought up or mentioned, which is why I'm discussing it here, as in its own right, it is a decent enough first-person shooter. This game came out in 2001, originally on the PlayStation 2, and was then ported to the GameCube and Xbox systems with very little to no actual changes made to the game. This is pretty evident, as graphically speaking, this has to be one of the uglier games in today's video. Something about this game has just always looked wrong to me. It's a little hard to explain, but this game definitely has that super early PS2 look to it. Another problem with it is that a lot of the concepts just don't feel fleshed out enough. For instance, there are missions here where you're supposed to be stealthy, but yet there really isn't a penalty for brute forcing your way through them. This game is also pretty short, only about 2 hours worth of gameplay here, not counting multiplayer of course, but let's be real, you're probably not getting friends to play this with you. With that said though, the gunplay is fun, the guns feel substantial and weighty, the story is at least somewhat entertaining, and there is some neat mission variety here. here. I think overall, if you're looking for a fun budget shooter on the system, have played your copies of Time Splitters 2 and, well, this game's sequel, 007 Nightfire to death, check this game out. It's a fun enough time for the afternoon or two it will take you to clear. Alright, so that is going to do it for today's video. If you want to know my picks for the 3 best games in today's video, I would say they are Wave Race Blue Storm, 007 Agent Under Fire, and Future Tactics The Uprising. However, I think each game has enough strengths to justify at least somewhat checking them out. If you liked what you saw today, please like this video down below. If you have a suggestion for next time, let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to see what I'm going to talk about next time, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn notifications on. Peace.